The Russian Revolution of 1917 was one of the most pivotal moments in 20th century history, leading to the fall of the Romanov dynasty, the end of the Russian Empire, and the rise of the Soviet Union. It was a series of political, social, and economic upheavals that changed Russia forever, marked by the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the execution of the Romanov family. By the early 20th century, Russia was an immense empire that spanned Europe and Asia, but it was also deeply divided and underdeveloped. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for over 300 years, but under the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II, the empire was crumbling. Nicholas, who became Tsar in 1894, was a devout autocrat who believed in the divine right of kings and resisted political reform. However, the country he ruled was experiencing profound social and economic problems. Russia was still largely agrarian, with a vast population of poor peasants and a growing working class in the cities. The Industrial Revolution had arrived late in Russia, and conditions for workers were harsh. Political repression was rampant, with no legal political parties or trade unions allowed, and dissent was met with violence by the Tsarist secret police, the Bokhrana. Adding to the discontent were Russia's repeated military failures. The disastrous defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, humiliated the empire and exposed the inefficiency of the military and government. This was followed by the Revolution of 1905, in which mass protests and strikes swept across the country. The Tsar was forced to make concessions, including the creation of the Duma, a legislative assembly, but these reforms were too little, too late. The final blow to the Romanov dynasty came with World War I. In 1914, Russia entered the war in support of its allies, Britain and France, against Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, the war proved to be a catastrophe for Russia. The army was poorly equipped and led by incompetent generals, and Russia suffered devastating losses on the Eastern Front. By 1917, millions of Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded, and morale was at an all-time low. At home, the war effort strained the economy, leading to food shortages, inflation, and widespread hunger. The Russian people were growing increasingly frustrated with the government's inability to address their needs, and many blamed Nicholas II directly for the country's suffering. The Tsar's decision to take personal command of the army in 1915 further damaged his reputation, as military defeats were now seen as his personal failures. Meanwhile, Nicholas left his wife, Empress Alexandra, in charge of domestic affairs. Alexandra, who was deeply unpopular due to her German heritage, relied heavily on the mystic Grigory Rasputin, which further alienated the Russian elite and fueled rumors of corruption and incompetence. By early 1917, Russia was on the verge of collapse. In March, February in the Julian calendar, strikes and demonstrations erupted in the capital, Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, as workers protested food shortages and high prices. The protests quickly escalated into mass demonstrations, and troops stationed in the city began to mutiny, joining the demonstrators rather than suppressing them. The situation spiraled out of control, and on March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne. He had lost the support of the military, the aristocracy, and even his own ministers. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty came to an end. Nicholas initially hoped to abdicate in favor of his son, Alexei, but the boy's poor health led him to pass the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who refused the crown. A provisional government was formed, led by members of the Duma, and it vowed to continue Russia's participation in World War I, which proved to be a fatal mistake. While the provisional government attempted to introduce democratic reforms, it lacked authority and struggled to address the country's deep economic and social problems. Amid the chaos of the provisional government, a new revolutionary movement began to gain strength. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, were a radical socialist faction that had long opposed the Tsarist regime. Lenin, who had been in exile in Switzerland, returned to Russia in April 1917 with the help of the Germans, who hoped that his presence would destabilize Russia further. On October 25, 1917, November 7th in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks launched a coup against the provisional government. The October Revolution was relatively bloodless, with the Bolsheviks seizing key government buildings in Petrograd and arresting the members of the provisional government. By the next day, the Bolsheviks were in control of the capital, and Lenin declared the creation of a new government, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. After his abdication, Tsar Nicholas II and his family, Empress Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son Alexei, were placed under house arrest. Initially held at the Alexander Palace outside Petrograd, the family was later moved to Tobolsk in Siberia and eventually to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. As the Russian Civil War broke out between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Army, the Romanovs became a liability for the Bolsheviks. Fearing that the advancing White Army might rescue the family, the local Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg made the decision to execute the Romanovs. On the night of July 17, 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their children, and a few loyal servants were led into the basement of the house where they were being held. There, they were brutally shot and killed by a Bolshevik firing squad. The bodies were secretly buried in a forest nearby. The execution of the Romanov family marked the definitive end of the Russian monarchy. The Russian Revolution did not just topple the Romanovs, it completely transformed Russian society. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, went on to win the Russian Civil War and establish the Soviet Union. In 1922, a one-party communist state that would last until 1991. The revolution also inspired communist movements worldwide, influencing global politics throughout the 20th century. The brutal end of the Romanov family became symbolic of the wider destruction of the old social order in Russia. For decades, the Romanovs were vilified by the Soviet regime, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, Nicholas II and his family were canonized as martyrs by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2000.